September 6th, 1997, Westminster Abbey. Just after 11 in the morning. A coffin draped in the royal standard moves slowly down the nave, carried by 8 Welsh Guards. On top sit 4 white floral arrangements, including a wreath from Diana's sons, and a letter in Prince Harry's 12-year-old handwriting, addressed to Mummy. The coffin is lined with lead, as British royal tradition requires, which means it weighs 1/4 of a tonne and shifts slightly in the guard's grip with every deliberate step down the aisle. Outside in the September streets, hundreds of thousands of people have been standing since before dawn. The queue to sign the Book of Condolences at its peak in the preceding days had stretched to a 6.5-hour wait. More than 100 cameras are deployed inside the Abbey and along the processional route. More than 300 reporters are working in London for a broadcast that an estimated 2.5 billion people are watching worldwide, in more than 180 countries. Every face in that building is visible to the world. In the front pews, the royal family sits together. Queen Elizabeth II, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, who has just walked part of the 4-mile route behind the gun carriage with his sons and their uncle Earl Spencer. And beside them, 97 years old, the oldest living Windsor by a wide margin, Elizabeth Angela Marguerite Bowes-Lyon, the Queen Mother. What people watching noticed, and what they kept returning to in the days and years afterward, wasn't only the grief visible in the streets outside. It was the comparative stillness inside the Abbey. Diana's former personal protection officer, Ken Wharf, writing from a position of declared loyalty to Diana, described the Queen, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the Queen Mother as sitting in what he called stony-faced silence during the service. Dickie Arbiter, the former Buckingham Palace press secretary, described the institutional mood in the surrounding days differently. The family was very angry, he said. Courtiers were apoplectic, shell-shocked. Not cold, furious. Institutional protectiveness under siege. The structural question that has followed this footage for nearly 3 decades is, why, on the day the world was watching a nation's grief, did the royal family appear to be watching something entirely different? The answer goes back much further than September 6, 1997. It goes back to at least September 13, 1940. That morning in 1940, German aircraft flying low over the Mall dropped bombs directly onto Buckingham Palace, hitting the quadrangle, the forecourt, the chapel, and the garden. King George VI and his wife Queen Elizabeth had been sitting together in a small room overlooking the quadrangle when the impact came. Winston Churchill would later observe that had the windows been closed rather than open, the glass would have splintered into their faces. "We all ducked like lightning into the corridor," the Queen Mother wrote in a letter to her mother-in-law Queen Mary that afternoon. "There was another tremendous explosion." They weren't injured. They sat in the corridor for a moment to avoid flying glass. Then they went outside to look at the damage. Craters in the courtyard, smoke still rising from the chapel. What happened next defined her public identity for the remaining 62 years of her life. The Foreign Office had been urging evacuation for months. Moving the children to Canada had been discussed at the highest government levels. The royal family's answer had come back clearly. They would stay. Rather than withdraw now, with bombs worth of evidence that the palace was an active target, she and the king climbed into a car and drove east. The East End of London had been bombed continuously for weeks by September 1940. Stepney, Bethnal Green, Whitechapel, streets of terraced houses with their fronts sheared off, living rooms exposed to the open sky, family photographs and furniture visible from the street, personal possessions scattered across the rubble and rain. Families were standing in what remained of their streets, some in what they'd been wearing when they ran for the shelters, others holding bags they'd grabbed in the dark. Estimates of civilian deaths in London during the Blitz would eventually reach nearly 30,000. The bombing of the palace happened when the East End already looked like a war had been fought directly through it for 3 weeks. The Queen Mother walked through the rubble alongside her husband. She didn't change into something more practical. She wore what she always wore in public: pale blue, carefully set hair, white gloves. One consequence of this, noted in historical accounts, was that she was reportedly heckled by some in the crowd for appearing in formal clothing amid the devastation. This complexity matters. Her presence wasn't universally received as solidarity, but she stayed. She stopped to speak with people. She looked at what had been done to their homes, and she looked directly at them while doing it. King George's private secretary, Sir Alec Hardinge, subsequently persuaded her to release a formal public statement. A photograph was issued alongside it. The Queen Mother, standing in the rubble of Buckingham Palace with her husband, upright, composed, looking directly into the camera. Her statement was brief. "I'm glad we've been bombed," she said. "It makes me feel I can look the East End in the face." Those 5 opening words, "I'm glad we've been bombed," compressed an entire philosophy into a single sentence. The palace had been hit. So had the East End. Shared suffering, no evacuation, no elaboration of the personal difficulty, no public display of fear. Presence. A brief statement that converted private survival into institutional solidarity by framing the bombing of her own home as welcome. What made this effective rather than merely propagandistic, or more precisely, what made it effective propaganda precisely because it was also genuine conviction, was that the code she was performing was one she had been absorbing since childhood. Her authorized biographer, William Shawcross, whose 2009 official biography drew on conversations the Queen Mother had specifically recorded for posterity with Sir Eric Anderson, the former Eton headmaster, described her as a woman of faith and patriotism, whose piety and courage enabled her to face down extraordinary challenges. The Los Angeles Times review of Shawcross's biography put the core assessment plainly. At her core, this wife of a king and mother of a queen took seriously the principles of decorum and duty. Decorum and duty. The phrase has been recycled so often in royal coverage that it has lost its sharpness. Inside, it lives a very specific belief that control of the visible self in crisis isn't merely a social nicety, it's a form of strength. That public emotion is self-indulgence, that what you endure in silence, you master, and what you display in public, you surrender. Elizabeth Bowes Lyon was born on August 4, 1900. She married Prince Albert in 1923, and when her brother-in-law, Edward VIII, abdicated in December 1936, her husband became King George VI overnight. The abdication crisis, a constitutional near-catastrophe, was handled in the old palace manner, managed, papered over, presented as resolved, never fully explained, simply moved past. She became queen consort, and in the royal family's private language, a senior partner in an institution her husband had a specific term for. King George VI called it the firm. The term wasn't affectionate. It described what the monarchy actually was: an institution with a function, not a family with feelings available for public inspection. George himself had modeled the code in its starkest form. He battled a severe stutter throughout his public life, not hiding it, not apologizing for it, but enduring it with a composure that the historian Ben Pimlott characterized as a deliberate form of public stoicism. You showed the difficulty. You didn't let it stop you. You never complained. The Queen absorbed this from her father. The Queen Mother transmitted it within the household and continued doing so for 50 years after his death in 1952. Penny Junor, who wrote The Firm, The Troubled Life of the House of Windsor in 2005, understood the palace as an institution that trained its members in a specific set of operational values. One of those values, circulating in academic literature on the 1997 monarchy crisis, has been summarized as never explain, never complain, be a royal. Nobody printed it on a banner. It was the operating code of an institution that had survived a Victorian empire, 2 world wars, an abdication, and the long post-war decline of British global power, and survived all of it by presenting an unbroken face to the world. Hugo Vickers, whose 2005 biography of the Queen Mother drew on the private recollections of people who had known her from her earliest years, described someone whose public persona was genuinely warm rather than cold. She was beloved, probably more than any other single member of the royal family at the time of her death. Her wartime appearances in bombed-out East London were warmth deployed strategically and confidently within precise rules. She felt, and showed as much as the code permitted, and in certain circumstances, standing in bomb rubble, visiting a hospital ward, showed it with considerable human force. The paradox the funeral photographs contain is exactly this. Her warmth operated entirely inside a set of rules Diana had spent 15 years demonstrating were no longer sufficient. By the time Diana's coffin moved down the aisle on September 6, 1997, the Queen Mother was 97 years old and had been a public royal for 74 years. Born at the literal opening of the 20th century, she had lived virtually its entire length. When she sat in those Westminster Abbey pews, she wasn't simply a person. She was a living institutional biography, the code itself, embodied, in a room where the code was losing. April 9, 1987, London's Middlesex Hospital. Princess Diana opens Britain's first purpose-built HIV/AIDS unit. It's a Thursday morning. There are 9 patients in the ward. Cameras are present, not by accident. The visit had been structured to be photographed. Diana moves through the ward and shakes hands with every patient without gloves. In 1987, the AIDS crisis is at its full terror in Britain. The disease has killed more than 1,000 people in the UK in the preceding 3 years. A government public information campaign featuring tombstones and icebergs has run on national television. A significant portion of the population genuinely believes the virus transmits through casual physical contact, through shared cups, through touch, through proximity. The tabloids have amplified this fear for years. The result is a social quarantine around AIDS patients that extends far beyond medical precaution. People who are ill, people who are dying, are widely regarded as untouchable. Diana walks into this ward and touches them. Specifically, she shakes hands, a formal greeting, a full extension of consideration, extended to 9 men who are dying of a disease millions of people believe spreads through touch. The photographs circulate globally within hours. The image of the most photographed woman in the world, ungloved, in a ward that most public figures had no interest in entering, makes a sustained argument about status and worth without a single caption. Her statement from the visit made the argument explicit. HIV does not make people dangerous to know, so you can shake their hands and give them a hug. Heaven knows they need it. The contemporaneous UPI wire dispatch recorded that she shook hands specifically to explode the myth that the disease can be transmitted by touch. The BBC's retrospective coverage confirms the bare facts of the visit. She opened the unit, she shook hands, she was photographed. What those facts contain is the structural significance. Diana had hired the communications consultant, Peter Settlin, a former actor, beginning in 1992. Her inner circle, according to biographer Tina Brown, regularly leaked her exact location to journalists. From as early as the Middlesex hospital visit, she had understood something the palace didn't want acknowledged. Royal visibility, deployed correctly, could be more powerful than royal ceremony. The old model offered distance as a form of respect, the monarchy as elevated symbol, separate from suffering. Her model offered proximity. The monarch's body in contact with the body of someone society was pretending didn't exist. This was a deliberate institutional strategy, not sentiment, and the palace was watching it with growing alarm well before 1992. Patrick Jefferson, Diana's private secretary for 6 years, acknowledged the increasing difficulty by the early 1990s of projecting Charles and Diana as a harmonious partnership. Palace courtiers had explained royal protocol to Diana repeatedly from the early days of the marriage. One account describes them explaining that her comportment in certain situations, specifically her choice to appear emotionally involved with the people she met, to be visibly affected rather than ceremonially composed, fell outside the established code. In 1991, Diana sat alone in her apartments at Kensington Palace and answered a journalist's questions on tape. The journalist was Andrew Morton, and the questions had been delivered through a mutual friend acting as intermediary, a method designed so Morton could truthfully deny having directly interviewed Diana. The recordings ran for hours. Morton later described the moment of listening. Turning on my tape recorder, I listened with mounting astonishment to the unmistakable voice of Princess Diana, pouring out a tale of woe in a rapid stream of consciousness. She was talking about her unhappiness, her sense of betrayal, her suicide attempts, and 2 things I'd never previously heard of: an eating disorder called bulimia nervosa and a woman called Camilla. Diana, her true story, was published in June 1992. It sold 5 million copies and was translated into 29 languages. No royal had ever done this. Publicly disclosed mental illness, an eating disorder, suicidal behavior, systematic isolation within the institution. In its first weeks, the book read less like a biography than like a report from inside a building whose exterior had given no visible indication of what was happening within. By December 1992, Prime Minister John Major was announcing the formal separation of Charles and Diana. Before publication, in January 1992, Diana had been warned that Buckingham Palace might move against her. She proceeded anyway. She wasn't naive about the consequences. November 20th, 1995, BBC Panorama. The interview was filmed in her sitting room at Kensington Palace. Equipment was smuggled into the building. The BBC Board of Governors was deliberately kept out of the planning. At 9 p.m. on a Thursday evening, the broadcast aired. In the UK, nearly 23 million people watched. Worldwide, the estimated audience was 200 million people across 100 countries. Diana sat in a chair in her own apartment in a black long-sleeved dress and discussed the most private facts of her life on the highest-rated program the BBC had ever broadcast. She talked about her bulimia in language simultaneously clinical and intimate. "I had bulimia for a number of years, and that's like a secret disease. You inflict it upon yourself because your self-esteem is at a low ebb, and you don't think you're worthy or valuable. You fill your stomach up 4 or 5 times a day, some do it more, and it gives you a feeling of comfort. It's like having a pair of arms around you, but it's temporary. Then you're disgusted at the bloatedness of your stomach, and then you bring it all up again." She described the family's response to her depression. "Maybe I was the first person ever to be in this family who ever had a depression or was ever openly tearful. And obviously that was daunting, because if you've never seen it before, how do you support it?" She named Camilla Parker Bowles as the third party in her marriage. "There were 3 of us in this marriage, so it was a bit crowded." She questioned whether Charles had the temperament for kingship. She told Martin Bashir she wanted to be a queen of people's hearts. The historian Katie Nicholl characterized the institutional damage with precision. Her casting doubt on Charles's ability to be a good king was hugely damaging to the institution. There is a fine balance between using TV as a medium to royal advantage and not letting too much daylight into the mystique of monarchy. 1 month after the interview aired, Queen Elizabeth II wrote to both Charles and Diana, urging them to finalize their divorce. By 1996, they were legally separated, and Diana's HRH title had been stripped. There is honest complexity here worth carrying. Diana's emotional openness was managed as well as genuine. She had a speech coach. Her location was regularly leaked to journalists. The 2021 Dyson Report, an independent inquiry commissioned by the BBC, found that Bashir had used deceitful behavior to secure the interview, including forging bank statements that fed paranoia within Diana's circle and making false claims about members of her household. Prince William later issued a statement saying the BBC's failures had contributed significantly to her fear, paranoia, and isolation that I remember from those final years with her. She was, in truth, both things at once. Someone who felt what she said, and someone who understood how media worked well enough to know when and how to say it. The palace's trained silence and Diana's trained openness were rival performances. What separated them was what each performance was for and who it served. The older royals didn't simply find Diana personally difficult. They found her structurally dangerous. When Dickie Arbiter described the family mood in the days after Diana died as very angry and courtiers as apoplectic, shell-shocked, he was describing institutional alarm rather than a grief too large for words. The fury is the revealing detail, not private sorrow about a missed human connection, but institutional rage at what had been exposed and what could no longer be controlled. The palace's theory of institutional power had always rested on managed distance and preserved ceremony. When Queen Elizabeth II's coronation in 1953 was proposed for television broadcast, there was genuine internal debate about whether cameras would destroy what one observer described as the magic of monarchy by presenting the Queen as a person rather than a symbol. The decision to televise was eventually made, but the objections were real. The subsequent 1969 royal family documentary, which allowed cameras into domestic royal scenes in an attempt to make the Windsors appear more relatable, was later regretted inside the institution. Each act of revelation cost the palace something it couldn't easily recover. Every window opened onto the ordinary was a window that couldn't be closed again. Diana opened every window she could find. King George VI had endured his stutter in public with what Pimlott characterized as a deliberate form of stoicism. The suffering was visible. The complaint was absent. The Queen absorbed this from her father. The Queen Mother transmitted it within the household for decades. Royal children were raised inside a system that treated emotional containment as a vocational requirement. Academic analysis of the 1997 monarchy crisis characterized what happened that September as the moment when the stoic and phlegmatic character of the British had been put to one side for something more emotional. The code Diana was attacking wasn't simply a royal peculiarity. It was bound up with a specific British tradition of governance. Self-governance through composure, public leadership through visible endurance. These weren't arbitrary rules. In 1940, the institutional calculation had been precisely correct. A composed, visible, present royal family served as evidence the country would hold. The code was survival equipment designed for conditions of genuine existential threat. The problem was that the conditions had entirely changed, and the code had not adjusted with them. Diana had grown up adjacent to this framework. Her father had served as equerry to both King George VI and Queen Elizabeth II, married into it at 20, and spent 15 years identifying exactly where it was hollow. She said in the Panorama interview that the family had never seen depression before and didn't know how to support it. She described a system that had taken her illness and converted it into a label. Diana is unstable. Diana is mentally unbalanced. She described institutional management masquerading as care. Every time she said this publicly, in the Morton book, in the Panorama interview, in the AIDS ward photographs, in the charity appearances where she sat on floors and held hands, she was advancing the same institutional argument. The system claiming to serve people was failing the people inside it, and therefore probably the people outside it too. By 1997, the public had largely accepted this argument. What happened in the week after her death was the public acting on a belief Diana had spent 15 years giving them permission to hold. Diana died in Paris in the early hours of August 31, 1997. She was 36 years old, in a crash in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel. The driver, Henri Paul, was later determined to have been speeding and under the influence of alcohol. Dodi Al-Fayed died in the same crash. The royal family was at Balmoral Castle in Scotland. By 7 in the morning, her sons had been told. 2 hours later, the family attended church at Crathy Kirk, the normal Sunday routine maintained. They didn't return to London. Flowers began arriving at the gates of Buckingham Palace and Kensington Palace almost immediately. By the afternoon of August 31st, the first bouquets were propped against the iron railings. By September 1st, they had become a wall 2 and 3 layers deep, stretching along the full width of the palace gates and back along the pavement. People left photographs cut from newspapers and magazines, school photographs in frames, handwritten notes on lined paper, and notes on the backs of receipts. They left soft toys, candles in glass jars, single-stem flowers tied with ribbon, unopened bottles of wine with cards attached. By September 3rd, the carpet of flowers stretched so far up the mall that you could no longer see the pavement beneath. The air in that September heat was thick with the smell of cut flowers beginning to wilt. 10,000 of them, then 50,000, then 100,000. People stood in this space for hours with no particular purpose, in groups of strangers who had nothing obviously in common except that they had felt compelled to come. They weren't conducting a protest. They were conducting something closer to a vigil, a gathering around a public absence, an implicit demand that the absence be formally acknowledged by the building from which no family member had emerged. In the same period, the palace issued 2 brief communiques. Neither mentioned Diana by name. No flag flew above Buckingham Palace. The Queen wasn't in residence, which meant the royal standard, the only flag traditionally flown at the palace, wasn't raised. The royal standard can't fly at half-mast because of a specific constitutional principle. The monarchy has no interregnum. When one sovereign dies, the next exists immediately. There is no gap in sovereignty to be expressed through a lowered flag. This was a real and defensible constitutional position. The public standing outside the palace gates in the September reign had no reason to know this distinction, and neither the palace nor the government explained it clearly in those critical first days. They saw an empty flagpole above a building from which no one had publicly emerged. The press registered this as coldness and said so with increasing force. The Daily Mirror published a leader on September 4th, attacking the royal family's perceived indifference. The New York Times ran the front-page headline, "Royal Family Stung by Critics, Responds to a Grieving Nation," on September 4th. A contemporaneous published account described the gathering mood at the gates with a single line, "Every hour the palace remains empty adds to the public anger." The New York Times noted separately in its own reporting that the royal family had issued only 2 brief communiques since Diana's death, and in neither did it mention the princess, a detail the public registered as a kind of erasure. Inside the palace walls and at Balmoral, the situation from Arbiter's account was genuinely turbulent. The anger, The sense of institutional siege, the sharp consciousness that the public's demands were targeting the institution itself rather than simply expressing grief, all of this was visible to those working within the palace structure. The code said, "Stay composed, trust the institution, don't be seen to respond to public pressure." The public said, "The code is wrong." The royal family was following the code. The code was destroying them. The Queen returned to London from Balmoral on September 5th, a day earlier than originally planned. The timing coincided with the peak of public pressure. ABC News Australia's retrospective account captured the pivot. On September 5th, the fever of public anger was broken in an instant by the Queen's arrival in London. Only 5 days had passed since Diana's death. That same evening, just before 6 p.m., Queen Elizabeth II addressed the nation on live television. She called Diana an exceptional and gifted human being. She praised her warmth and kindness. She told the nation she spoke from my heart. She explicitly said she admired Diana. These weren't phrases Queen Elizabeth II had used in public broadcasts in 1973 or 1983 or even 1993. They were emotional disclosures of a kind the institution had consistently and deliberately resisted for decades. Diana had made them necessary. On September 6th, the Union Jack flew at half-mast over Buckingham Palace for the first time in the palace's history. The constitutional argument against flying the royal standard at half-mast held. It can't fly at half-mast, full stop, regardless of circumstances. The Union flag was ordered there in its place by direct decision of the Queen, in explicit acknowledgement of what the public had demanded. Protocol had been rewritten in 5 days. That permanent rewriting would outlast the crisis. Since September 1997, the Union flag flies from Buckingham Palace whenever the monarch isn't in residence, and at half-mast upon the deaths of members of the royal family. Neither of these things was true before Diana's death. The institution had acquired, under duress, a permanent new habit of visible acknowledgement. The flag that says someone was here, someone has died, someone's absence matters. Imposed from outside. Built into the institution's operating rules, because a crowd stood in the September rain and refused to leave until the building acknowledged them. 2,000 people were seated inside Westminster Abbey on the morning of September 6th. The British television audience averaged 32.10 million, roughly 59% of the entire British population at the time. The global audience of an estimated 2.5 billion people in more than 180 countries makes it one of the most watched televised events in recorded history. The coffin had traveled the 4-mile route through London streets on a gun carriage, behind a mounted escort, flanked along every inch by crowds standing 5 and 6 deep. At St. James's Palace, Prince Philip, Prince Charles, William, Harry, and Earl Spencer had joined to walk behind it. Philip had initially opposed the boys taking part in the procession. Several adults had privately described the idea of having 2 grieving children walk behind their mother's coffin as a barbarity. Philip ultimately joined them, reportedly telling his grandsons, "I'll walk if you walk." William later described it as one of the hardest things I've ever done. Harry said no child should be asked to do what they did. Both boys walked the full route, and William said afterward he saw it as maintaining balance between duty and family, a sentence that could have been written by the institution itself, showing how thoroughly the code had been transmitted to a generation that had also watched its mother spend 15 years fighting it. As the cortege reached the approach to Buckingham Palace on the route to the Abbey, Queen Elizabeth II stood outside with the royal family and bowed her head as the coffin passed. A reigning monarch does not bow to those of lower rank. Diana had held no HRH title. It had been stripped in the 1996 divorce. The Queen bowed anyway. That single gesture, caught by every one of the 100+ cameras tracking the procession, was the most formal possible acknowledgement that something had permanently shifted. Inside the Abbey, the service executed with the military precision of a plan in preparation for more than 2 decades. The plan was codenamed Operation Tay Bridge. It had been rehearsed for 22 years. It had originally been designed as the operational framework for the Queen Mother's own funeral, for the day when the palace's most beloved, most institutionally traditional member would be laid to rest with the full weight of royal ceremony. The machinery built for her was deployed, in the end, for a woman the institution had spent a decade in active conflict with. The logistics were identical. What they signified couldn't have been more different. The Dean of Westminster, Wesley Carr, had personally appealed to senior palace aides to include what he specifically described as something of the modern world that the princess represented. Elton John sang a rewritten version of Candle in the Wind from near the choir stalls, with new lyrics written by Bernie Taupin at John's request. A solo saxophonist had been under serious consideration as a second option. The old palace and the new era negotiated over every element of the service's design. Then Charles Spencer rose to give the eulogy. The Guardian's contemporaneous account, published September 8th, captured what it felt like inside the building. The voice only started cracking towards the end, as emotions started to overtake the bite of the content. But already the rapier wound had landed. Spencer called Diana the most hunted person of the modern age. He described her natural nobility, language that quietly and publicly refused to accept the stripping of her formal title. He spoke about blood family and about his sister's sons growing up inside an institution. He didn't name who he was addressing. Everyone in the building understood. The crowd gathered outside in Hyde Park, watching on enormous screens erected in the park, heard it too. They began to applaud. The applause moved through the air and through the stone walls of the Abbey and entered the service from outside. Inside, it rippled forward through the pews until those within the building began to applaud as well. It was the first time applause had ever been heard inside Westminster Abbey during a funeral service. In the front rows, the institution absorbed it. That is what 2.5 billion people were watching. 2 different answers to the same question about what a royal body was for. Outside, weeping, applause, the breakdown of formal ceremony, the public refusing to play its assigned role of silent witness. Inside, composure held, the mask in place. There is something that footage of Diana's funeral keeps doing to audiences nearly 3 decades later that deserves examination as its own distinct phenomenon. The impulse to watch it, to pause on the royal family's faces, to read the stillness as evidence of something. This is specific, not general. It's a particular psychological act with a particular object. Diana had spent 15 years building one of the deepest parasocial relationships in modern celebrity history. She spoke directly about her pain in language people recognized from their own experience. She wept in public. She sat on hospital ward floors. She was photographed at landmine clearance sites in Angola in a simple outfit, no visible ceremonial apparatus. She described her bulimia on the most-watched interview in BBC history, using precise, ashamed language. You don't think you're worthy or valuable. That people who had kept similar secrets recognized immediately and carried with them afterward. The relationship she built with hundreds of millions of people was, by every available measure, more intimate than any public persona any member of the British royal family had ever constructed. Her death broke that relationship without resolution. No farewell, no final word, no closure in any of the forms the relationship had taught people to expect. The footage of the funeral became the proxy for grief that had nowhere else to go. When viewers watch the royal family's faces in that footage, they are performing an act of social scanning as old as human grief itself, looking across a room at a funeral to see who else feels what you feel, checking whether the loss registers in the people who should have known her best. The stillness of the royal family, whether Worf's characterization is precisely accurate or whether it simply represents the appearance of composed bearing under the most intense public scrutiny imaginable, reads as the face of an institution that didn't grieve the way the public grieved. And that gap is the one Diana spent her entire public life naming. The Queen Mother functions as a particular focal point in these readings because she is both the most visible representative of the old code and its most complete embodiment. Understanding that, why the mask existed, what it had protected, why Diana's challenge to it was structural rather than merely personal, is what draws audiences back to the footage across generations. They are watching an ideology that shaped the 20th century at the precise moment it lost the public argument. The legacy extends through every subsequent wave of royal coverage. When Prince Harry's 2023 memoir described a family in which emotional expression was still not the operating currency, writing that he had never hugged his grandmother, the Queen Mother, the tension Diana named in 1995 was still audibly present. When Harry and Meghan stepped back from formal royal duties in 2020, citing the institution's handling of Meghan's mental health, the academic framework connecting that departure to the anti-monarchist strain in British public culture that dates specifically from 1997 is the same argument carried forward into a new generation. The New York Times, on the 20th anniversary of Diana's death in 2017, stated the legacy plainly. A central, if unlikely, piece of her legacy is how she reshaped the monarchy that rejected her, and how she reshaped Britain, too. The Guardian that same summer was more direct still. Public sympathy for her undermined the monarchy all the same. That came to a head in the week after her death. The funeral didn't create the divide it made visible. That is the point the cameras captured and have been capturing ever since. The divide had been building since April 1987, when Diana shook an AIDS patient's hand in front of photographers, and the palace's theory of emotional restraint was visibly outflanked. It had grown through the Morton book, through Panorama, through 5 million sold copies and 200 million viewers, through the stripping of the HRH title that the public registered as punishment for honesty. By August 31, 1997, Diana had already won the ideological argument. She had demonstrated, across 15 years of specific and deliberate public acts, that emotional availability wasn't incompatible with royal significance. The argument that composure was the gift and managed distance was the price of authority had been losing ground at least since 1992. September 6th was the simultaneous witness to an argument already decided. An estimated 2.5 billion people watching the same room at the same moment, able to see both versions of monarchy in the same building and compare them in real time for the first time in history. The Queen Mother sat in that abbey as a specific kind of participant. She was attending a ceremony that used her own funeral plan. Operation Tay Bridge had been rehearsed for 22 years in anticipation of her death, the palace deploying it, in the end, for the woman who had spent 15 years challenging what that plan's tradition of royal ceremony stood for. She sat in the abbey as both the intended subject of that institutional machinery and its most unexpected witness. She was the product of a code that had served Britain through genuinely catastrophic moments, a code that held a frightened nation together in bombed-out streets by presenting an unbroken face to the world. And she had played her part in that with real physical courage, in her own bombed home, in the rubble of the East End. The code had a logic and a history, and specific conditions under which it was the correct response to crisis. The problem was that the conditions which had made it necessary had passed, and the code remained unchanged until a young woman from the Spencer family married into it and found it insufficient. Diana came along and showed the country that the same emotional suppression that had once been survival equipment could, in peacetime and in prosperity, function as something else entirely. It could function as the institutional management of suffering rather than its relief. In September 1997, with flowers stretching the length of the mall and newspapers demanding visibility and a crowd forcing a protocol rewrite in 5 days, the palace paid the price of decades of emotional unavailability. The permanent consequence is visible. The Union flag now flies from Buckingham Palace when the monarch isn't in residence, and at half-mast when members of the royal family die. Neither of these things was true before September 1997. The institution's habit of visible acknowledgement was imposed from outside, by a public that had learned from Diana what acknowledgement should look like. The flag that flew at half-mast for the Queen Mother herself in April 2002, 5 years after the funeral, flew according to rules Diana's death had forced into existence. She was mourned under Diana's protocol. The machinery built in her name, used for someone else's funeral, returned to her at last, changed by everything that had happened in between. What the cameras captured on September 6, 1997, wasn't a mask slipping. It was a mask staying in place, in a room where the walls had already come down. The Queen Mother's face at Diana's funeral became powerful because it seemed to show the palace before Diana, watching the world after Diana. Subscribe for more stories like this